Someone told you what you were before you had a chance to prove otherwise. Maybe it was the kitchen table conversations you were never supposed to hear, the way your mother sighed when the bills came, the phrase your uncle used so casually it never even registered as a label, "We are not the kind of people who." You absorbed those words the way a child absorbs everything, completely, without defense, without question. And then you grew up and started making decisions. Somehow, without ever choosing it, those decisions had a shape, a familiar shape, the shape of someone who holds back right before something good, the shape of someone who earns just enough and stops, the shape of someone who believes, in a place too deep to argue with, that money moves towards certain people and away from people like you. Here is what nobody has said to you directly. That belief was not yours to begin with. You did not arrive at it. You were handed it, pressed into your hands before you were old enough to refuse, labeled before you earned a single dollar, lost a single dollar, or made a single financial decision. The label came first, the identity followed, and then the evidence arranged itself around the identity, the way evidence always does until the whole thing looked like the truth. It is not the truth. What you are about to hear will not teach you a new money habit. It will do something older and more necessary than that. It will show you the name you have been answering to, the exact moment it was assigned, and the precise reason you were never the person that name described. By the end, that label will not fit you anymore. Chapter 1. You were never poor, you were just mislabeled. Chapter 1. Someone named you broke before you earned. Across every age of human civilization, there is a pattern so consistent it almost looks like law. In every era, in every language, in every corner of the world where people have gathered and built lives together, some people move through the world carrying a name that was never truly theirs. Not a name on a birth certificate. A deeper name, the kind whispered into your bones before you were old enough to question it, the kind that tells you not just what you have, but what you are, what you deserve, what you can expect from this life. Most people spend decades trying to earn their way out of that name. They never realize the name itself was the problem, not the number in their bank account. What you are about to hear is not a philosophy about money. It is about you specifically, about the exact moment someone handed you a label, and about what happens when you finally read what that label actually says. You were somewhere between 4 and 10 years old the first time it happened. Maybe you were standing in a grocery store. You reached for something cereal, a candy bar, a box of crackers with a cartoon on the front, and the hand that loved you most pulled yours back. The words that followed were quiet, sometimes apologetic, sometimes clipped and tight with stress. "We can't afford that." Or maybe it was sharper, "Put it down, that's not for us." You didn't have the language for what you felt in that moment, but you felt it. A small door closing somewhere inside you, the sense that the world was divided into two kinds of people, and you had just been told which side you were on. That moment did not teach you about money. It taught you about your name. Return to the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. Not financially, just emotionally. Think about the story you told yourself when a bill came in you couldn't cover, or when someone invited you somewhere you couldn't afford to go. Was there a voice in that moment? A familiar one, almost like a memory. That voice has a long history. It started long before you had a salary, a credit card, or any financial responsibility at all. It started in rooms you sat in as a child, listening to adults talk about money the way other people talk about weather, as something that happens to you, as something beyond anyone's real control. This is where the open question lives, and it deserves to stay open for a moment. If the beliefs you carry about money were formed before you made a single financial decision, what exactly are those beliefs based on? Sit with that. The answer is coming, but it needs the right ground to land on. The word poor, when your family used it, was rarely just a description of a bank balance. It was a membership card, a coat of paint applied to everything. The house was poor. The neighborhood was poor. The options were poor. You absorbed it the way children absorb language, not by studying it, but by living inside it. By the time you were old enough to have an opinion about money, the opinion was already fully formed and waiting for you. Somebody else had filed the paperwork on your financial identity before you showed up to sign anything. Here is a parable worth sitting with. A woman named Clara grew up in a house where the heat got turned down every October, not because the family truly could not pay the bill, but because her father had grown up in a house where that was simply what October meant. His father had done it before him. Clara watched her father check the thermostat the same way he checked for rain clouds, with the resigned readiness of someone who expected difficulty. She grew up, moved out, got a job that paid reasonably well, and found herself turning the heat down every October. Not because she was cold, not because she was struggling, because something in her read October as the time for tightening. One autumn, her coworker asked why her office was always the coldest on their floor. Clara started to answer and stopped. She realized she did not have an answer, only a habit, only an inheritance she had accepted without ever opening the box to see what was inside. Clara had never been poor, but she had been handed a relationship with scarcity so early and so thoroughly that she had worn it like her own skin. There is something important in that story that is easy to miss. The habit was not about money at all. It was about identity. Clara's thermostat was just the visible part of a much larger architecture, one built in her childhood, room by room, out of the materials available. Every family that ever struggled or believed it was struggling or lived next to people who were struggling constructed that architecture, and they passed it on, not maliciously, not even consciously. The way you pass on eye color or the shape of your hands, you receive it, you inhabit it, and because it has always been there, you never think to ask whether it belongs to you. Language was the first tool of the mislabeling. The phrase, "we can't afford it," sounds like a financial report. It is not. It is an identity statement. It draws a circle around what is possible and plants you firmly outside it. Children are absorbing the rules of the world at a rate adults cannot match. They receive that statement as fact, not as one household's reality in one difficult month, as a law of nature, as the way things are for people like us. You heard those words often enough that they stopped being something said to you and started being something you said to yourself. They moved from outside to inside, from their voice to yours. That migration is the core wound this book addresses. Here is what actually happened. You were born without a single opinion about money. You arrived complete, curious, and entirely without a financial identity. The label came later. It was applied by hands that meant you no particular harm, just hands passing on what they had been given. neighborhood conversations about who drives what car, dinner table sighs over bills, the particular silence that fell in your house when money was the thing no one said out loud. All of it added up to a composite portrait of you, a portrait painted by other people in other people's colors to fit a frame that was never meant for you. You answered to that portrait. You have been answering to it ever since. Here is the revelation this chapter is building toward, not as a comfort, but as a factual correction. Your poverty, if you have ever genuinely experienced it, may have been financially real, but the poverty identity is different. The sense that scarcity is in your nature, that you are constitutionally less equipped for financial stability than the people who seem to have it easily. That part was never real. That part was a label, a story assembled from borrowed material and placed on your chest before you could read. You did not choose it. You did not earn it. And you cannot inherit it, because it was never the truth about you. This is not optimism. Optimism is the hope that things might go well. What this is instead is accuracy. An accurate reading of how financial identity actually forms, not from the money you have or don't have, but from the meaning given to that money by the people who raised you, the culture that framed you, and the neighborhood that narrated you. All of that happened upstream from your choices. All of it arrived before you had the words to push back. Now return to the open question from earlier. If those beliefs were formed before you made a single financial decision, what are they based on? They are based on other people's experiences, other people's fear, other people's limitations. That is what a label is. Someone else's story pressed onto your skin, given your name. Further on, you will run into an idea about breaking a poverty mindset that overturns the common assumption. When that becomes clear, it starts changing how you act from that point forward. But for now, one thing matters more than any technique or strategy. The name you answer to is not the name you were given at birth. It is the name you were given by circumstance. And the first step toward anything different is the same step Clara never took, the step of opening the box, looking at what is inside, and asking, honestly and without mercy, whether this belongs to you. It doesn't. It never did. The question the next chapter will answer is this: if someone else wrote that story, exactly when did you decide to keep it? Chapter 2. The label became the lens, then the life. You already believe something about money that is not true, not slightly off, not a minor miscalculation, completely, structurally wrong in a way that has been costing you every single day. Most people who feel behind financially believe the cause is outside them. Bad luck, bad timing, a market that was rigged before they arrived. That belief is understandable. It is also backwards. The real cause is older than any market and quieter than any economy. It was placed inside you before you were old enough to notice it happening. And what was placed inside you was not a fact. It was a name. You have been answering to it ever since. A question came out of the last chapter and it is still alive. If someone else wrote the story you have been living, exactly when did you decide to keep it? That question is not rhetorical. The answer has a moment, a real one. Tracing it backward will show you something that changes everything about how you move forward. Here is the thread this chapter will pull on. Why do two people with equal intelligence, equal opportunity, and equal access to information end up at radically different places financially? The standard answer involves discipline or hustle or luck. But none of those answers explain what happens before behavior, before you decide to pursue something or avoid it or ignore it entirely. Something filters the world for you. Something decides what you see and what you walk right past. That something is a label. And you need to understand how deep it goes before you can understand how to remove it. Rosa grew up in a house where money was discussed the way weather is discussed in a place that only floods. Always arriving, always damaging, always something to survive. Her mother used a phrase that Rosa heard so often it stopped sounding like a phrase and started sounding like a fact. "We are not money people," her mother would say. Not bitterly, casually. The way you might say we are not tall people or we are not athletic people. It was descriptive, not dramatic. That made it worse. By the time Rosa was 9, she had absorbed the full meaning. Money people were others. They lived in houses with driveways. They ordered off a menu without checking prices first. They did not worry. Rosa's family worried. Rosa's family was resourceful and warm and deeply loving, but they were not money people, and that was simply the shape of things. At 16, Rosa got a job at a bakery 2 blocks from school. She was efficient, reliable, fast. The owner, a woman named Denise, noticed. Within a month, Denise offered Rosa a key to the shop and asked if she would open 3 mornings a week. Rosa said yes. She felt proud. Then Denise mentioned, almost in passing, that she had been thinking about opening a second location. She needed someone she trusted to help run the first one more independently. Rosa smiled and nodded and said nothing about being interested in what that could mean for her. Later that night, she thought about it for approximately 4 minutes and then stopped. She was 17. She was not a money person. That was someone else's conversation. Denise eventually promoted someone else. Rosa was not even surprised. Think about what did not happen in that moment, not what Rosa lacked, not what the world denied her. Think about what she filtered out before it ever had a chance to land. The opportunity was not invisible. Denise had practically handed it to her. Rosa walked past it because her label told her it was not addressed to her. That is the mechanism. That is what a label does that nothing else can do quite so efficiently. It does not block opportunity from existing. It blocks you from recognizing that it belongs to you. Here is where this gets precise. The human brain is a filtering machine above all else. Every second you are awake, millions of pieces of information compete for your attention and your brain discards almost all of them. What determines what survives that filter? Relevance. And relevance is determined by identity. You notice what matches who you believe you are. You ignore, dismiss, or explain away everything that contradicts that belief. This is not laziness. It is efficiency. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem is that your brain was given a flawed map of who you are, and it has been navigating faithfully from that map ever since. When your identity says you are not a money person, your brain quietly, automatically, without malice or drama, stops forwarding you the messages that money people receive. A conversation about investing gets filed under "not for you." A comment from a colleague about a business opportunity bounces off instead of sticking. A moment where you could have asked a question, made a connection, or simply said "I am interested" evaporates before you even feel the impulse. None of this announces itself. That is what makes it so effective. Picture the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly, not just financially. Think about the conversations you walked away from early. The ideas you talked yourself out of before you even spoke them aloud. The times you watched someone else do something and thought that is not for someone like me without ever asking yourself who decided that. Those were not failures of opportunity. They were moments where the label was working, doing its job, keeping you inside the outline someone else drew. This is the tension beneath everything that Chapter 1 introduced. The story you inherited was not just a narrative, it was a lens. And once a lens is in place, you do not notice the lens. You only see what it lets through. You assume what you see is the full picture. Why wouldn't you? It is all you have ever seen. Rosa is in her late 20s now. She manages a retail chain. She is good at her job. She is not in debt. She is not struggling by the standards of her childhood. But she is also exactly as financially still as she has been for 6 years, and she cannot explain why. She works hard. She is responsible. She saves a little. From the outside, it looks like steady progress. From the inside, it feels like running in a room that moves backwards at the same speed she runs forward. She has not thought about that conversation with Denise in years. If you asked her, she would not connect the two things. And that is the most important part of this whole story. The label does not announce itself when it acts. It does not step forward and say, "I am preventing you from pursuing this." It simply makes the alternative feel irrelevant or unrealistic or somehow slightly embarrassing, like reaching for something that was clearly meant for someone else's hands. The feeling is so quiet and so familiar that most people never name it as a label at all. They name it as reality. Soon, you will run into an idea about where ambition actually comes from that overturns the common assumption. After that clicks, it starts changing how you read every decision you have made about money. But right now, back to the mechanism. Because here is the revelation that has to land clearly before anything else makes sense. You do not see opportunities your identity says you do not deserve. Not because the opportunities are not there. Not because you are not smart enough to spot them. Because your brain, faithfully and silently executing the label it was given, has been routing those opportunities directly to the discard pile before they ever reach your conscious attention. You were not failing to act. You were never given the chance to act because the filter caught it first. This is what mislabeling does that poverty alone cannot do. Poverty is a condition. Mislabeling is a lens. Poverty can change when circumstances change. A lens changes nothing when circumstances change because a lens changes what you see. And if you cannot see a different outcome as belonging to you, you cannot move toward it. You can work harder inside the same frame, but the frame itself stays exactly where it was placed. Rosa is not a symbol of failure. She is a precise illustration of a filter working perfectly on the wrong setting. She is what happens when a warm, capable, intelligent person answers to a name that was never actually hers. You have been answering to a name too. You know you have. The question is no longer whether the label exists. The question is when you first decided it was yours. And more importantly, whether anyone ever actually gave you the right to hand it back. That question is exactly where the next chapter begins. Chapter 3. Scarcity is a costume, not a skeleton. Saving less money does not make you poor. That sounds like financial nonsense, the kind of advice a person gives when they want to excuse bad habits. It is neither nonsense nor an excuse. It is the first crack in a wall you have been pressing against your whole life. The reason most people stay broke has almost nothing to do with how much they save or spend. It has everything to do with what they believe they are. You have been solving the wrong problem. You have been rearranging furniture in a room you were told was yours, never questioning whether the room was ever yours to begin with. Something handed to you before you were old enough to refuse. It is running the financial decisions you made last Tuesday. Once you see exactly what that something is, the problem stops being about money. It starts being about a name you have been answering to without knowing who gave it to you. That question is exactly where the next chapter begins. This is that chapter. Here is what you need to understand first. Scarcity is not a skeleton. It is a costume, and the difference between those two things is everything. A skeleton is structural. It holds you up. Remove it and you collapse. A costume is something you put on, or in some cases, something someone else put on you when you were too small to resist. You can wear a costume for so long that you forget it is not your skin. You can wear it until it fits the shape of your body. You can wear it until people call you by the name stitched across the front of it, and you turn around when they do, and neither of you realizes the name was never yours. A single question drives this chapter beneath the rest of this chapter. Hold it in your mind right now. If two people experience the same financial hardship, why does one rebuild and the other repeat? Same circumstances, different outcomes. That gap has a reason. And the reason is not discipline, not intelligence, and not luck. The reason lives deeper than any of those things. Think about a man named Marcus. He grew up in a city where the grocery store closed before the bus ran, where his mother stretched one bag of rice across a week, where the word no was the most common answer to anything he wanted. Marcus was not stupid. Marcus was not lazy. Marcus worked. He saved in the margins of a life that did not give him many margins. Then, at 31 years old, Marcus won a state lottery. Not the kind of winning that changes a neighborhood, the kind that changes everything. $2.3 million after taxes, deposited into an account that had never held more than a few $100s at one time. People around Marcus celebrated. They said he had finally escaped. They said now his life would be different. And Marcus believed them because why would he not? 3 years later, Marcus was broke, not robbed, not scammed, not the victim of some extraordinary misfortune. He had simply spent, given, and lost the money the way water finds its level. Slowly and without drama until one morning the account read what it had always read. And Marcus felt, somewhere underneath the shame, something that disturbed him more than the shame. He felt familiar. He felt like himself again. That is the part nobody talks about. The money was gone, but the costume was still on. The lottery had removed the circumstance. It had not removed the identity. Marcus did not lose $2.3 million because he lacked financial knowledge. He lost it because he was still wearing a self-concept that had no room for that amount. His nervous system, his daily decisions, his relationship to money itself, all of it was still calibrated to a life of shortage. The costume of scarcity was still on. It directed every choice he made until the outer world matched the inner world again. Scarcity is not about your account balance. It is about who you believe you are when you look at the account balance. Let that settle for one moment. Financial circumstance is a weather condition. It changes, sometimes cruelly and sometimes slowly, but it changes. It responds to new inputs. It is not permanent. Poverty identity, though, does not change with the weather. It is the coat you wear because you have forgotten it can come off. Marcus did not need a lottery. He needed to recognize that the shortage he carried was borrowed. It was given to him by a world that had its own scarcity. And in the only way a child can survive that world, he took it on as truth. You have done the same thing, not necessarily in the same proportion, but somewhere in some room at some age, someone handed you a belief about what kind of person you are with money. They may not have used those words. It may have been the way your parents went silent when a bill arrived. It may have been the way the word rich was spoken in your house, with a bitterness that taught you wealth was something that happened to other people. People who were somehow different from your family and therefore different from you. It may have been subtler than that. A single comment from a teacher. A year where Christmas was thin and nobody explained why. A neighborhood whose edges told you everything about where you ranked. None of it was your fault, but here is what matters now. You absorbed that story, and you have been living inside it ever since. Making choices, avoiding opportunities, spending or hoarding or numbing, all in ways that confirm the story, all without examining whether the story is even true. Later on, you will run into an idea about discipline and financial success that overturns the common assumption. Once you grasp that turn, it starts changing how you act on the very next decision you face. But right now, stay here. There is something practical waiting for you in this chapter, and it requires honesty. Go back to your relationship with money back then and notice the difference. Not your income, not your job title. Think about how you felt standing in line at the grocery store. Whether you checked the total before you got to the register. Whether you felt that particular tightness in your chest on the first of the month. Whether you celebrated a raise and then immediately started calculating how much you still did not have. Think about the emotional texture of money in your life. Was it peaceful or anxious? Was it open or constricted? Was there a version of you that believed, somewhere beneath all the hoping, that you were just not the type of person who gets ahead? That belief, that specific feeling, that is the costume, and you have probably been wearing it so long that you have been calling it your personality. Here is the identity audit. Not a worksheet, not a list of affirmations. A set of honest questions you answer inside your own chest because the answers live there, not on paper. Ask yourself what your first money memory is, not the first time you had money. The first time you understood that some people have it and some people do not, and you understood which category your family was in. Feel where that memory sits in your body. Notice whether it carries weight. Then ask yourself who taught you that, not who told you. Who showed you through the 100 daily ordinary moments that teach without speaking. Then ask the question that matters most. Is that still true? Not was it true then? Right now, today, for the person you have actually become, is that still true? Because the costume was fitted to a child, and you are not that child anymore. The measurements are wrong. You have outgrown the thing that was placed on you, but you may still be walking around in it because nobody told you there was a door out of that room. Circumstance changes. Identity, without examination, does not. That is the gap between Marcus after the lottery and the version of Marcus who could have built something that lasted. The outer numbers shifted dramatically. The inner story did not move at all. And the inner story always wins. Not because it is stronger than circumstance in some mystical sense, because it directs behavior, and behavior is what shapes circumstance over time. The good news is singular and enormous. A costume can come off. If scarcity were skeletal, if it were woven into your actual nature, then this book would have nothing real to offer you. But it is not. The research on this is not soft or motivational. People who consciously examine the origin of their financial beliefs, who trace the handed-down story back to its source and ask whether they chose it, do actually behave differently with money over time. Not because they found more willpower, because they stopped spending energy maintaining a story that was never theirs. You were handed a label. It was pressed onto you by people who were themselves labeled, in houses where scarcity was the weather for so long that everyone stopped questioning whether it had to stay. They gave you what they had, and what they had was a name that said not enough. But here is what they did not know. That name was always a sticker. It was never a tattoo. The label came off the moment you recognized it as a label and not as your skin. Marcus's story did not end at broke. He spent the following 2 years doing something harder than winning the lottery. He traced the story. He found the room where he learned what kind of person gets money and what kind loses it. He found the quiet inheritance that no lottery ticket could override. And he started, slowly and with consistent effort, to live from a different premise. Not that he was rich, not that abundance was automatic, but that the shortage he carried was borrowed and he was ready to give it back. The question is not whether you can afford a different life. The question is whether you are still wearing someone else's answer to that question. Chapter 4. Your ancestors were never your financial ceiling. Someone else's story is living inside your wallet right now. Not your story, theirs. It arrived before you were old enough to question it. It settled into the walls of how you think about money, and it has been compounding its cost every single month since then. That cost is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It works the way interest works, quietly, consistently, invisibly. Every week you carry a financial identity that was never yours is another week the gap widens between where you are and where you were always capable of being. The mechanism behind this is not laziness. It is not a lack of hustle or ambition or desire. It is something far more specific and far more correctable. It is the belief that blood is destiny. That what your family had or did not have sets the outer boundary of what you can have. That ceiling is not real, but the belief in it costs you real money every single day. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly why. The last section handed you a question, and it is still alive. Whether you are still wearing someone else's answer about what you can afford. That question is not rhetorical. It is pointing directly at something that lives inside most people without a name. So let us give it a name. Let us call it the lineage ceiling, the invisible cap installed in childhood, reinforced through every holiday dinner conversation about money being tight. Reinforced every time a parent said, "We're not those kinds of people." Every offhand comment that stitched financial smallness into the fabric of who you believed yourself to be. You did not choose it. Nobody warned you it was happening. It was spoken into you the way a name gets spoken into a child before that child can respond. Here is a question that will take a few minutes to fully answer. The answer matters more than you might expect right now. What is the earliest memory you have of your family talking about money? Not numbers, not accounts or transactions. The feeling, the tone of voice, the tension in the room or the absence of it. Hold that memory, because that memory is where the labeling began. Rosa Calderon's grandmother crossed a border with $11 and a sewing kit. Not a metaphor. 11 literal dollars and a canvas bag that held 3 spools of thread, a pair of scissors worn smooth at the handles, and a thimble her own mother had pressed into her palm at the door of a house she would never see again. Within 4 years, that grandmother had a small alterations shop on a street corner in a city she barely knew. Within 12 years, she owned the building. Rosa's mother grew up in a family that understood at a cellular level that nothing about their starting point determined their ending point. Money was not a fixed thing. It was a responsive thing. You worked it, you respected it, you moved with it, and it moved with you. Then the labeling system arrived. It arrived the way it always arrives, through other people's words, through the slow accumulation of being seen a certain way, through a school district that handed Rosa's mother a set of expectations shaped entirely by her last name and her address, through a neighborhood that said, without saying it aloud, that people like us do not go past a certain point. The family that had crossed a border with $11 and built something real, that family began slowly to answer to a different name. Not the name they came with, a name that was given to them, a name that said, Striving is what you do, arriving is for other people. By the time Rosa was born, the shop was gone. The building had been sold during a hard year. And Rosa grew up hearing a different story than the one her grandmother had lived. She grew up hearing that money was something that happened to other people, that their family had tried and it had not worked out, that the smart thing was to be careful, stay safe, expect less. The $11 and the sewing kit had become a story about struggle, and Rosa, without knowing it, had been handed a label, not a fact, a label, one that said, "This is your ceiling and it is lower than you think." She believed it for most of her 20s. She worked hard. She was responsible. She was not reckless with money. But she also never reached, never built, never demanded more from her financial life than the label permitted. Every time an opportunity showed up that felt too large, a quiet voice reminded her who her family was, what they had tried and lost. She thought she was being realistic. What she was actually doing was answering to a name that was never hers. Revisit the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. The things you wanted, the reasons you told yourself those things were not realistic for someone like you. Were those reasons facts? Or were they someone else's story, handed down so many times it started to feel like autobiography? This is the part that takes a moment to absorb. It will feel uncomfortable before it feels freeing. Your family's financial history is real. The struggle was real. The sacrifice was real. The years of not enough were real, and honoring that reality matters. But real and permanent are not the same thing. A neighborhood is real, but you can leave a neighborhood. A diagnosis is real, but it is not the same as a prognosis. What happened to the people who came before you is data, not decree. It tells you something about the conditions they faced, the tools they had, the information available to them, the systems that were working against them. It tells you nothing, not one thing, about what is available to you. The labeling system does not want you to know this distinction, because the moment you see it, the ceiling dissolves, not slowly, immediately. Here is what the labeling system actually is. It is not a person. It is not a conspiracy. It is a set of inherited stories told with such consistent conviction that they begin to function like truth. Your grandmother worked herself to exhaustion and still could not hold onto what she built, and so the story becomes, building does not hold for people like us. Your father worked 40 years for a company that handed him a pension and a handshake, and so the story becomes, loyalty to a system is the only safe path. Your mother clipped coupons and worried out loud at the kitchen table, and so the story becomes, there is never quite enough, and the appropriate response to money is anxiety. None of these people were wrong. They were responding rationally to what they knew and what they had been shown. But the story they passed on was never meant to be your permanent instruction manual. It was a record of their conditions. You are operating in different conditions, and that difference is enormous. As this book keeps moving, you will run into an idea about inheritance that overturns the common assumption. Not money left in a will, but the thing passed down before anyone dies. When that contradiction resolves, it will change the specific action you take next time a financial decision lands in front of you. For now, hold this. The name you answer to shapes every choice you make before the choice even reaches your conscious mind. Rosa spent years answering to a name that said her family's reversal was her inheritance. She was wrong. Her real inheritance was a grandmother who crossed a border with $11 and built something from nothing using only skill and belief and forward motion. That story was always available to her. She just could not see it through the label. The day Rosa stopped answering to the label was not a dramatic morning. There was no single revelation. She was sitting in her car outside the bank where she had just declined a small business loan application she had not even submitted yet. She had talked herself out of walking through the door before she got out of the car. She sat there and thought, whose voice is this? It did not sound like hers. It sounded older, more tired, like a voice that had already lost something and was trying to protect her from losing it again. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got out of the car and walked through the door. The loan was not large. The business she started was not immediately successful, but something changed the moment she stopped letting someone else's loss set the limit on her reach. She was no longer answering to the label. She was answering to herself. Lineage is a starting point on a map. That is all it is. It tells you where you launched from, not where you are capable of landing. The people who came before you gave you something real, their endurance, their sacrifice, even their mistakes as lessons you did not have to learn the hard way. But they could not give you your ceiling, because they never actually had the authority to set one. That authority was always yours. The labeling system placed a number on you before you could read. It called it your family's financial story, wrapped it in love and tradition and identity, and handed it to you as if it were biology. It is not biology. It is a sticker. And stickers, no matter how long they have been on something, come off. You have been living as the label's answer to the question of who you are. But the question itself was always yours to re-ask. What name are you actually willing to answer to? Chapter 5. The name you answer to writes your future. Saying I am not good with money is not a confession. It is a command. That sounds like a distinction without a difference. You have probably never thought of it that way, which is exactly why it keeps working on you. A confession looks backward at something that already happened. A command reaches forward and instructs the future. Every time that phrase leaves your mouth, some part of your behavior obeys it. You have just told yourself who you are. And the self is a system that spends its whole life proving itself right. Here is the question underneath all of this, the one this chapter is built around. When did you first say that sentence out loud? Not last week, not last year. When did you first hear it aimed at you before you had the vocabulary to argue back? Because somewhere between that first moment and right now, you stopped hearing it as someone else's opinion. You started hearing it as your name. That is the loop. And this chapter is going to show you exactly how it runs. Call up the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. Not your bank balance. Not your job. Think about what you called yourself when money came up in conversation. Think about whether you laughed a little when you said it. The way people laugh at something they have decided is just true about them. The way you might say you have bad knees or an unreliable sense of direction. Something fixed. Something inherited. Something you stopped fighting. That small laugh is not humor. It is resignation dressed up as self-awareness. And resignation is expensive. Here is what the cost actually looks like. A woman named Claudette worked in the billing department of a regional hospital for 9 years. She was precise, organized, and deeply good at tracking numbers that belonged to other people. She caught errors her colleagues missed. She flagged discrepancies before they became problems. Her supervisor described her as one of the most financially meticulous people on the team. At home, Claudette's savings account had a balance of $41. Every time someone asked how she managed her own finances, Claudette smiled and said the same thing. I am terrible with money personally. That is why I work with other people's. The people who heard this laughed. Claudette laughed too. And then she went home and let her electricity bill sit unopened for 3 weeks. because opening it felt like beginning an argument she already believed she would lose. She was not bad with numbers. She was bad with the number that carried her name on it. The label was not about competence. It was about identity. And identity is not a skill set. It is a permission structure. There is a reason this is worth sitting with before moving on. The loop that ran Claudette's finances was not in her brain the way a habit lives in a brain. It was in her language. Specifically, it was in the sentence she repeated so many times it stopped feeling like a sentence and started feeling like a fact. She had answered to it for so long that she could no longer hear the question underneath it. The question was, who said so? In a later section, you will run into an idea about self-discipline and financial behavior that overturns the common assumption. When that point settles, it starts changing how you act every single time money feels threatening. But right now, the mechanism needs to be clear. When you say a sentence about yourself, the brain does not file it as opinion. It files it as instruction. Neuroscientists call this the self-reference effect, but you do not need the terminology. You have lived it. You know that a comment someone made about you in 6th grade still lives in your body in a way that a compliment from last Tuesday does not. Negative identity statements root deeper and root faster than positive ones. The nervous system treats threat information as priority data. This is not a flaw. This is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The problem is that the design did not account for cultural mislabeling. It did not account for a parent who was themselves mislabeled telling their child the same lie they were told. It did not account for a classroom where scarcity was the shared assumption. A neighborhood where no one ever talked about building anything because survival was already a full-time job. The system took all of that in and sorted it into the same category as real threat data. And now, you walk around with a label pressed into you before you were old enough to read it. You announce yourself with that label every time the conversation turns to money, and the system obeys. Here is the specific mechanism. You say the phrase. The brain registers it as identity data. Identity data filters perception. That means you notice evidence that confirms the identity and move past evidence that contradicts it. You forget the time you negotiated a bill down. You remember the overdraft. You forget the month you came in under budget. You remember the credit card. The label is not passive. It is a lens that actively edits your experience. And here is what makes it worse. Every time you say it out loud, you do not just reinforce it internally. You invite other people to treat it as a fact about you. You hand them permission to see you a certain way. You make it socially true by saying it in a room, and social truth is almost as powerful as internal truth. You start shaping your behavior to remain consistent with what you have already announced. This is why the language detox is not optional. It is structural. There are specific phrases that re-sign the contract. You are about to hear them and you will recognize every one. I am terrible with money. That is the primary one, the mother label, but it has children. I could never save like that. People like me do not invest. Money just disappears when I have it. I was not raised to think about money. Rich people are just lucky. Each one of these sounds like an observation. Each one is a command. Each one tells your future self exactly how to behave. The replacement is not a positive affirmation repeated into a mirror. Do not do that. That approach bounces off because it does not carry the weight of evidence. What you are doing instead is inserting a pause between the identity and the verdict, turning a statement into a question, creating space where the command used to live. I am terrible with money becomes money has been confusing for me so far. Notice the difference in architecture. The first sentence describes who you are. The second describes what has happened. The first sentence closes a door. The second leaves it open. You are not lying to yourself. You are refusing to let a pattern from the past write a prescription for the future. I could never save like that becomes I have not built that habit yet. People like me do not invest becomes I have not started investing yet, but that is a solvable problem. Money just disappears when I have it becomes I have not yet found a system that catches it before it moves. Every replacement follows the same logic. Past tense for the pattern. Present tense for the possibility. The word yet doing heavy work at the end. This is not about optimism. Optimism is a feeling. This is about accuracy. The original phrases were inaccurate. They described a fixed identity where there was only a situation. They described a permanent condition where there was only an unresolved one. The replacements are more accurate, not more cheerful. Now here is the part that requires honesty. You are going to resist this, not because the resistance is logical, but because the label has been providing something. A label that defines you as someone who cannot succeed with money also protects you from the vulnerability of trying and failing. If you are already the person who is bad with money, you do not have to risk being the person who tried to be good with money and came up short. The label is armor. Exhausting, expensive, life-limiting armor. But armor. And taking it off means standing in a room with no cover. Most people stop here. They feel the discomfort and mistake it for evidence that the label was true. But the discomfort is not evidence. It is just what exposure feels like when you have been protected for a long time. Go back to Claudette. 2 months after a conversation with a colleague who asked her, simply, why she tracked other people's numbers with such care but refused to apply the same precision to her own, Claudette opened a spreadsheet. She started treating her household account the way she treated the hospitals. Not because she had a new skill, because she had a new permission. The same competence she had always had was simply aimed somewhere new, and she let it go there. Within 6 months, she had saved enough to move her family into a safer neighborhood. Not because she discovered a secret, because she stopped commanding herself to fail. The name you answer to is not the name you were given at birth. It is the name you have said back to the room so many times that the room started expecting it. And the room will adjust. It always does. The room adjusts to whatever you decide to answer to consistently. Every time you say, I am not good with money, you re-sign the label's contract. Every time you catch the phrase before it leaves your mouth and replace it with something accurate, you decline to renew. Over days, over weeks, over months. The contract runs out. And when it runs out, you are no longer obligated to perform the identity it described. The label was always a sticker. What name are you actually going to answer to from here? Chapter 6. Original abundance is already in the account. Right now, something is draining from you. Not dramatically, not with warning. Quietly, the way water disappears from a glass left out overnight, you do not watch it go, but when you come back, less is there. Every hour you spend performing a version of yourself built on someone else's fear of money is an hour you are not building from what is actually true. And the cost is not just lost time. It compounds. The opportunities you do not reach for because you have been told reaching is dangerous. The rooms you do not enter because you have been told those rooms are not for people like you. The income you do not pursue because something underneath your choices keeps whispering that you are not the kind of person who earns that. You were not born with that whisper. Someone gave it to you. And this chapter is where you start to hear the difference between that voice and your own. That question from the last chapter, what name are you actually going to answer to from here, is not rhetorical. It is a choice with daily consequences. The label does not just describe you. It instructs you. It tells you what to want, what to avoid, what is reasonable, and what is ridiculous. And the deepest trick of any label is this: it makes you do its work. You carry it. You enforce it. You answer to it so consistently that eventually you stop noticing the call. Here is what most people are never told: scarcity is not your origin. It is a destination you are steered toward, and it takes constant maintenance to stay there. Think about that for a moment. Scarcity requires work. Maintaining a poverty identity demands daily effort from you, from the people around you, from every system that benefits from your smallness. But your original state, the one you came into this world wearing, did not carry those instructions. A child does not know it should feel ashamed about what it does not have. A child does not calculate whether it deserves food before it asks for it. That shame, that calculation, that preemptive apology, those are installed later. And what is installed can be removed. Before long, you will run into an idea about the moment when financial life finally changes that overturns the common assumption. After that really registers, it starts changing how you act, not just how you think. But first, meet Rosa. Rosa grew up in a house where the phrase "we can't afford that" was spoken before anyone even checked. Not after looking at the account, before. The checking was not the point. The phrase was a reflex, an identity statement dressed up as a financial fact. Rosa was young enough when she first heard it that she absorbed it the way children absorb language, not as information but as atmosphere. It became the weather of her inner world, overcast by default with rare and surprising patches of sunlight. By her late 20s, Rosa had a job that paid her decently. Not extravagantly, decently. Enough that the phrase "we can't afford that" was no longer always accurate. But she still said it. She said it about dinner with a friend she could have covered. She said it about a class that cost less than her monthly streaming subscriptions combined. She said it about a flight home for a birthday she genuinely wanted to attend. The words came out on their own, smooth and automatic, long before her actual account balance entered the picture. And one afternoon, standing at a checkout counter with $42 in her cart and $160 in her checking account, she heard herself say it again, out of habit, to no one, just the reflex running on its old programming. She stopped. She looked at the screen. She looked at her phone, at the number sitting there, solid and real. For the first time, she felt the gap between the label and the truth, not as a theory, as a physical sensation, like catching yourself flinching from a punch that was never thrown. Rosa did not celebrate that moment. She did not write it in a journal or call a friend. She stood there for a few seconds, put the items on the belt, paid for them, and walked out. But something had quietly rearranged. She had seen the machinery, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What Rosa discovered at that checkout counter is the same thing you are being asked to see right now. The labeling system does not require a villain who wakes up each morning plotting your limitation. It does not need malice. It runs on repetition. The people who handed you the poverty label were handed it too. They passed it along the way you pass anything you have always carried, without ever inspecting it, because it was already in your hands before you knew enough to ask where it came from. But here is the thing about a label. A label is not the object it is stuck to. Pull the label, and the object remains exactly what it always was. Bring to mind the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. Not just financially. Think about the story you were telling about yourself. The ceiling you assumed was just the ceiling. The ask you stopped yourself from making because you already knew the answer. Think about what you believed was fixed. What you treated as simply the shape of your life. when really it was the shape of a borrowed story you were living inside. You were not wrong to believe it then. You believed what you had been given. But you are hearing this now, and that means some part of you already suspects the label is not accurate. That suspicion is not wishful thinking. It is recognition. It is you beginning to tell the difference between your voice and the one you inherited. Original abundance is not a financial statement. It is not the claim that you already have all the money you will ever need. It is something more fundamental than that. It is the recognition that your relationship with resources, with opportunity, with possibility, with your own capacity to generate and receive, was whole before anyone told you it was not. The wholeness came first. The wound was added later. Scarcity identity is heavy because it is foreign matter. It does not belong to the organism. Your body does not naturally run on shame about what you have or do not have. Your instincts do not naturally include the assumption that asking is dangerous or that receiving is suspicious. Those are responses that were conditioned in, and conditioned responses require constant reinforcement to stay active. Stop reinforcing them and they begin to fade. Not immediately, not without discomfort, but consistently, the way unused muscle memory softens over time when the movement stops. This is what Rosa began doing after the checkout counter, not with a plan, not dramatically. She began noticing the reflex before it completed. She would feel the old phrase rising, the "I can't," the "that's not for me," the automatic contraction, and she would pause, just pause. She would not always replace the thought with something positive or powerful. Sometimes she would simply not finish it. The sentence would start, and then she would let it dissolve, the way you let an unnecessary word drop from a sentence without replacing it. Silence where the label used to be. And in that silence, something older and quieter was already there. A steadiness that did not need to be built. It only needed to stop being buried. This is the revelation the chapter has been moving toward. It is worth landing slowly. Poverty identity demands constant effort to sustain. It requires the daily recitation of limits, the habitual avoidance of certain thoughts, the reflexive shrinking before any room full of possibility. It is exhausting in the way that holding a position you do not believe in is exhausting. The effort shows, even when you cannot name it. Original abundance requires nothing from you except that you stop contradicting it. It is not a destination. It is a baseline. It is already the account you came into this life holding, before anyone convinced you it was overdrawn. You do not have to manufacture it. You have to stop spending energy maintaining the story that it is not there. That is the work, not the loud, ambitious work of acquisition and hustle. The quiet, specific work of noticing when you are doing the labor of your own limitation and simply putting it down. Not once, many times. As many times as the reflex has been practiced. Because that is how old habits dissolve, not in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of small refusals to repeat. Rosa began earning more within the same job, not because her salary changed, but because she stopped pre-declining opportunities before they were fully offered. She asked for the assignment she had been watching someone less qualified handle for 2 years. She raised the number she named in her next negotiation, not to double it, but by enough that it felt honest rather than safe. The money moved because her posture changed. And her posture changed because the label she had been answering to lost its authority, one small refusal at a time. The label always needed your cooperation to stick. That is the part no one tells you. It was never fused to you. It was resting there, held in place by nothing stronger than your repeated agreement. So the question now is not whether abundance is available to you. The question is simpler and sharper than that. What does it cost you every single day to keep insisting it is not? Chapter 7. Wealth literacy is a label override code. Knowing the right word is worth more than knowing the right person. That sounds like something a librarian would say to a child who hasn't learned to read yet. You might be tempted to wave it past. Don't. The people who hold the most wealth in this country are not necessarily the smartest in the room, not the most connected, not the most disciplined. They are, almost without exception, the most fluent. They speak a language you were never taught, and they never stop to wonder whether you were listening. The system that kept that language exclusive was not accidental. It was the design. The moment you learn the vocabulary of money, you don't just gain information. You gain a new name. And the labeling system, the one that stamped scarcity onto your identity before you were old enough to argue, cannot survive a person who refuses to answer to the old name anymore. What does it cost you every single day to keep insisting it is not? That question from the last chapter is not rhetorical. The cost is measurable. It shows up in the accounts you don't open, the contracts you don't read, the conversations you leave early because the vocabulary in the room makes you feel like a stranger at a gathering that wasn't meant for you. And here is what is strange about that feeling. It was engineered, not by malice necessarily, but by omission. And in some ways, omission is worse. When something is withheld long enough, you stop noticing it was withheld. You just decide you were never meant to have it. There is a word most people learned in school only as a math term: assets. You learned it alongside liabilities, probably in a chapter you skimmed because it felt far away from anything real in your life. An asset, in the textbook definition, is simply something you own that has value. But the people who built their financial lives on this word understand it as something more physical than that. An asset is a thing that puts money in your direction without requiring your daily hours in exchange. That distinction is not academic. That distinction is the line between two completely different relationships with time. Here is what no one told you about the word asset when you were growing up. The fact that you didn't have one was used to prove you couldn't have one. Your family didn't own property, so the conversation about property as a tool never happened at dinner. You didn't hear about dividend accounts or rental income or equity stakes in small businesses, not because those things didn't exist, but because the vocabulary for them wasn't spoken in your house. And when vocabulary isn't spoken, the concepts behind those words don't fully form. You can't think fluently in a language you've never heard out loud. Go back to the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. Not as an exercise in regret, but as a measurement. Think about the financial words you knew then versus the ones you know now. Think about whether the conversations you had about money were mostly about scarcity, about what couldn't be afforded, what was too expensive, what would have to wait, or whether they were also about positioning, about what could be built, about what $1 in the right place could grow into. Most people, when they do this honestly, realize that the language they had available to them at 22 or 25 was the language of expenses, not the language of construction. That is not a personal failure. That is a vocabulary gap, and vocabulary gaps close. There is a woman named Celestine who grew up in a household where the word leverage was never spoken except in the context of a complaint. Her parents talked about leverage the way people talk about something that happens to other people. The landlord was leveraging them. The bank was leveraging them. Someone else always seemed to have the fulcrum, and they were always on the wrong end of it. Celestine was 29 years old when she first encountered the word in a different context. She found it in a library book she picked up because the cover felt urgent and the price was nothing. She read that leverage, in the context of building wealth, meant using a smaller amount of your own money to control a larger asset, with the income or growth from that larger asset working in your favor. She read that sentence 4 times, not because it was complicated, but because she was doing something most people do when they encounter a word that reorders their entire childhood. She was recalibrating. She was pulling up every memory that featured the word leverage and relabeling it. Her parents hadn't been passive. They had been unleveraged. There is a profound difference between those two things, and Celestine felt it in her chest like something clicking back into place. She didn't run out and buy property the next morning. What she did was subtler and more lasting. She started listening differently. In conversations about money, she began hearing the presence or absence of specific words. She noticed who spoke in terms of returns and who spoke only in terms of costs. She noticed who talked about what a dollar could do and who talked only about what a dollar wasn't enough for. And slowly, the way a person adjusts to a new city until it becomes their city, Celestine learned to speak the language she had been denied. Not because someone finally invited her into a room, because she decided the room had her name on the door all along. After Celestine realized what the word leverage actually meant for her, she sat with that feeling for a moment. She let it be what it was. That moment before action is where the real change happens. Here is the open loop this chapter planted at the start, and it deserves an honest close. The question was whether knowing the right word is truly worth more than knowing the right person. The answer is yes, specifically because words create the conditions in which the right people recognize you as one of their own. Fluency signals membership. When you walk into a conversation about money and you can speak about assets and liabilities with precision, about compound growth and the difference between active and passive income, about leverage as a tool and not just a threat, something shifts in the room. Not because you impress someone, but because you stopped presenting yourself as a visitor. You are no longer reading from a phrase book. You are thinking in the language. Compound is the third word that matters more than most people allow it to. You have heard it before. Interest that earns interest. A small amount growing not in a straight line but in a curve that steepens as it goes. You know the concept, but knowing the concept and feeling entitled to apply it are two different things. The labeling system has a quiet trick it plays on people who were taught to see themselves as financially marginal. It lets them understand compound growth as an idea while still keeping them outside it as a practice. You understand it the way you might understand how a beautiful house is built without ever picking up a hammer. The concept lives in your head as information for other people. The label says that's for them. Peel the sticker. Compound is not a privilege. It is a mechanism. A mechanism doesn't care what neighborhood you grew up in. It doesn't check your family history or ask who told you money was always scarce. It operates the same way for every dollar that is pointed at it. The reason you weren't pointed at it earlier is the same reason you weren't handed the vocabulary. The system that profits from your scarcity needs you to experience money as something you react to, not something you direct. The moment you understand compound as a tool you can pick up, the transaction between you and that system changes. Learning financial language is not about becoming a different person. This is where most financial advice gets the story wrong. It frames education as transformation, as if you have to shed who you are and rebuild from scratch. That framing is itself a product of the labeling system, because it implies you were broken to begin with. You were not broken. You were mislabeled. The label said poor. The label said not for you. The label said watch from the outside. But the label was never your name. It was a stamp someone else pressed onto you before you could spell your own name, let alone argue against theirs. Down the line in this book, you will run into an idea about timing, specifically about when it is too late to change your financial identity that overturns the common assumption. Once that becomes real to you, it starts changing how quickly you move. Wealth literacy is the override code because language is how identity is maintained. The labeling system doesn't use chains. It uses vocabulary. It keeps certain words in certain rooms and teaches people on the outside that those rooms were never meant for them. And the inverse is also true. The moment you carry the language in your own mouth, the label loses its adhesive. It starts to peel at the edges. You begin to answer to a different name, not a name someone gave you, but the name you chose when you finally understood the naming was always yours to do. Assets produce. Leverage multiplies. Compound sustains. These are not exotic concepts. They are the three corners of a very old and very simple structure that has existed long before any one generation. And the only thing that kept you outside that structure was a vocabulary that was deliberately left out of your inheritance. You have the words now, and a person who has the words has something the labeling system never planned for. What will you build now that you finally know what to call it? Chapter 8. Stop performing poverty for belonging. Something is being taken from you right now, and it does not make a sound. It is not your money. It is not your time, though those are going too. What is being taken is the permission to rise, and it is being collected quietly by the people closest to you. Every time you shrink yourself in a family conversation, every time you downplay what you earned, hide what you saved, apologize for the ambition that keeps surfacing in you like water through concrete. Each of those moments is not just uncomfortable. It is compounding. The version of you that stays small to keep the room comfortable is not a neutral choice. It is an investment in a future you do not actually want. And here is what nobody tells you about that cost. It does not only cost you money, it costs you identity. The identity you have been quietly building, one decision at a time, underneath the label you were handed before you ever had a say in the matter. The question this chapter is going to answer is not whether you can afford to rise. The question is whether you can survive what rising reveals about the people around you. That question will stay open for a moment. Hold it. You know what it feels like to walk into a room and adjust. Not physically. Something smaller than that. Something internal. You lower the energy of your ideas when certain people are present. You choose different words. You reach for a version of yourself that fits the shape of the space, and you leave the fuller version somewhere outside the door. You do this so fast you almost do not notice doing it. Almost. Remember the life you were living at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. Not the circumstances, the feeling. The way you spoke about money in front of your family. The way you introduced yourself at gatherings. The things you quietly wanted but never said out loud, because saying them would have made you sound like someone you were not supposed to be. That person who stayed quiet was not protecting themselves. They were protecting a belonging. They were paying a membership fee, and the currency was self-suppression. That is the mechanism nobody draws a diagram of. You can see a pay stub. You can see a debt balance. But you cannot see the toll that community takes on your financial growth when that community has organized itself, unconsciously, around a shared poverty identity. When the group's cohesion depends on everyone staying approximately the same, the person who starts to change does not feel like progress to that group. They feel like a disruption. Here is where Rosa enters the story. Rosa grew up in a household where money was discussed in one of two ways. Either there was not enough of it, or someone outside the family had taken it unfairly. Both conversations ended the same way, with a closed door and a quiet acceptance that this was simply how things were. She loved her family. She still does. That is the part people forget to say, so say it clearly. Rosa loved them completely, with no asterisk, no footnote of resentment. But love and limitation can live in the same house. And they did. When Rosa was 27, she started a small bookkeeping service out of the second bedroom of her apartment. Within 14 months, she had 6 steady clients, a waiting list, and an income that had grown to nearly 3 times what she had made at the fulfillment warehouse where she had worked since she was 19. She did not buy a new car. She did not post about it. She told her mother first because that felt right, because she was proud, because she thought her mother would be proud too. Her mother's first response was a pause. Then, "You think you are better than us now." Rosa had not said that. She had not implied it. She had said she was doing well, but the label heard something else, and the label spoke back through her mother's mouth. 3 weeks later, her cousin stopped returning calls. Her aunt made a comment at Sunday dinner about people who forget where they came from. Rosa had not gone anywhere. She had added something. But addition to a group that has centered itself around a shared lack can look exactly like subtraction. What you just felt hearing that is not just Rosa's story. The open loop from the beginning of this chapter is starting to come into focus. The question was whether you can survive what rising reveals about the people you love. Survival is the wrong frame. Let us find a better one. Here is the principle underneath all of it. When a group has organized its identity around scarcity, around not having, around us and them, around the quiet nobility of struggling together, your prosperity does not threaten their finances. It threatens their story. A story that has been told long enough starts to feel like the truth. When you stop living inside that story, even partially, you are not just changing your bank account. You are introducing evidence that the story was never fully true. That is what the label cannot tolerate. Not your success, your evidence. This is the labeling system doing what it was always designed to do, not through one villainous person. Through the whole invisible architecture of expectation and belonging that forms inside families, inside neighborhoods, inside circles of people who have navigated the same conditions for so long that the conditions start to feel like character. The system does not need to be malicious to be effective. Your relatives are not your enemies. They are, in many cases, people who are also carrying labels they never chose. The label perpetuates itself not through cruelty but through fear. The fear that if you can do it, then something about their staying was a choice they could have made differently. That is a devastating thing to consider. So most people do not consider it. They call your growth betrayal instead. And here is the revelation. That is not them speaking. That is the label defending itself through them. Let that land exactly where it needs to. The label is not a neutral descriptor. It is a living system with a survival instinct. It uses the voices of the people you trust most because those are the only voices with enough access to reach you. A stranger calling your ambition arrogant is noise. Your mother pausing before she responds, that lands in a different place entirely. The label has always known this. It has always worked through proximity, through history, through the specific texture of your specific relationships. This is not paranoia. This is mechanism. You are not imagining the resistance. The resistance is real. But the source is not love. The source is a system of identity that was installed in that room long before you arrived, and it is simply running its program. So what do you do with that? You do not perform poverty anymore. That is the first thing. Performing poverty is real and it is specific. It is downplaying your income when someone asks. It is buying the cheap version of something you can now afford because you do not want to look like you have changed. It is saying, "I got lucky," when luck had very little to do with it. It is laughing at the joke about rich people, even when you are trying, privately, quietly, with everything you have, to become someone with enough financial stability to stop worrying every single month. Performing poverty for belonging is the act of making yourself smaller than you are to preserve a relationship that may, if you are honest, already be changing whether you perform or not. Here is the hard part. You cannot perform your way back into a belonging that was always conditional on your staying a certain size. The belonging that requires you to be less than you are is not actually belonging. It is a lease agreement with clauses you never read. Rosa figured this out in a moment that surprised her with its simplicity. She was at a family gathering about 6 months after the tension had started, and her younger cousin, 19 years old, second year at community college, pulled her aside and said, "How did you get your clients?" Not with resentment, with hunger, with the kind of genuine wanting that you recognize because it once lived in your own chest loudly before you learned to quiet it. Rosa spent 2 hours with her that afternoon. She gave her everything she knew, and in that moment she understood something the label had never told her. The people coming up behind you are not threatened by your rise. They are watching it to see if it is possible. Your ascension is someone else's permission. This is the original abundance returning, not as money, as influence, as proof of concept, as the living example of something the label insists cannot be done. A little later, we will get to a point about self-worth and financial identity that overturns the common assumption. When that idea snaps into focus, it starts changing how you decide what you deserve. For now, this is the thing to hold. Belonging that costs you your original nature is not worth the price. The people who punish your growth are carrying their own unlived potential, and they are pointing it at you because you have done something they have not yet given themselves permission to do. That is their work, not yours. Your work is to stop standing in the doorway between who you were labeled to be and who you have always actually been. The label is loudest right before it loses its grip. You do not need their permission to remove it. You never did. Who, in your life right now, are you performing poverty for, and what would you do differently if you stopped? Chapter 9. The sticker peels, your real name appears. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen left behind one recurring image. Across different languages and different centuries, in stories told around fires and in letters pressed into stone and clay, there is always the same figure. Someone who was told what they were, believed it for a long time, and then one day stopped. Not dramatically, not with a great speech or a turning point the world could witness. They simply stopped answering to the wrong name, and everything changed. That pattern is older than any book you have read or any teacher you have had. It is older than money itself. And right now, in your life, in the specific situation you are sitting inside of, that pattern is asking to happen again. The question this chapter is going to press against is this. What if the name you have been answering to was never attached to you the way you thought it was? That question was left open at the end of the last chapter. It deserves a real answer. Who are you performing poverty for, and what would you stop doing if you quit the performance? Sit with that. Because the answer points directly at the label, not a stamp pressed into metal, a sticker. And this chapter is about the moment the sticker peels. Her name was Rosa. She was 29 years old and she kept a small notebook in her jacket pocket wherever she went. Not to track expenses, though she did that too. She kept it because her grandmother had told her when she was 7 years old that people who write things down are people who believe their thoughts matter. Rosa's grandmother did not have much, but she believed that, so Rosa wrote. What Rosa wrote for most of her 20s were numbers that never added up in her favor. Rent, phone, groceries, the occasional fee she could not explain but could not escape. She wrote those numbers down and looked at them and felt a tightening in her chest that she had learned by 22 to call normal. That tightening had a name. She had given it one without meaning to. The name was, "This is just how it is for people like me. People like me." 3 quiet words that contained a whole world. Rosa had not chosen that phrase from nothing. She had heard it at the kitchen table growing up. She had heard it from friends who said it without bitterness, just as fact. She had heard it implied in every conversation about the future that ended with a shrug instead of a plan. The label had been applied before she had the vocabulary to question it, and because it had been there so long, it had started to feel like skin. Here is what no one told Rosa. A label that feels like skin is still not skin. She found out on a Tuesday in March, and not because anything dramatic happened. She was sitting in the break room at work, notebook open, and she wrote a number down. A small amount she had moved into a separate account that week, not much, the kind of amount that felt almost embarrassing to call savings. She stared at it, and something shifted in the way she was looking at it, not the number, the label underneath the number, the invisible one that said, "This doesn't count for someone like you." She wrote next to the number in small letters, "Whose voice is that?" Not a question she was asking anyone else. A question she was asking the voice itself. Whose is this? Because it did not, in that moment, feel like hers. Think about the earliest memory you have of feeling behind. Not just short on money, behind. Like other people had already been given information you had missed, a set of rules handed out when you weren't in the room. When did that feeling first arrive? Who was in the room when it did? Because that feeling did not originate inside you. It arrived from somewhere outside and you absorbed it before you could evaluate it. That is the open wound this whole book has been pressing toward. Not your bank account. The story beneath the bank account. The name someone pressed onto you before you knew names could be refused. Rosa kept writing. Over the following weeks, she started noticing a specific thing. Every time she was about to make a financial decision, not a big one, even small ones, there was a voice that spoke first. It was cautious in a way that felt inherited, tight in a way that felt older than her. She started writing down what the voice said, not to argue with it, just to see it outside her head where it could be examined rather than obeyed. What she found, written out across 2 pages, was not her financial philosophy. It was her grandmother's fear and her mother's exhaustion and her neighborhood's collective resignation, all braided together into something that sounded like wisdom because it had been repeated so many times. It was not wisdom. It was a label, and it had been stuck to her. The moment she saw that clearly in her own handwriting, something loosened. Not everything. The numbers did not change that day. The rent was the same. The account was still small. But something in how she held herself in relation to those numbers began to shift. Because a label that has been named can be evaluated. A label that lives in the dark, running as background noise, feels like truth. Bring it into the light and it is just a sticker. Stickers come off. They leave a residue, yes. You may have to work at the edges for a while. The sticky film does not vanish in an instant. But the object underneath, the actual surface of who you are, was never marked. Was never permanently changed. The label covered something. It did not become something, You were never poor. Say that quietly. Not as a chant, not as motivation, but as a factual observation about a misclassification. You were a person with original capability and original worth who was handed a label by a system, family, circumstance, culture, repetition, that did not know you, could not see you clearly, and was mostly passing on what had been handed to it. You received it. You wore it. Of course you did. You were young, and it came from people you trusted. And there was no one standing nearby to say, "Wait, read the fine print, check whether this was ever meant for you." No one did that for Rosa either. She did it herself. On a Tuesday in a break room with a pen and a small notebook and a question written in her own hand. The revelation is not complicated. You cannot spend your way to a different identity. You cannot save your way to one either. You can only see the label for what it was, someone else's handwriting, and decide with full clarity that you are done answering to it. That decision is not made once in a big moment. It is made again and again in small moments, every time the old voice speaks first and you pause before you obey it. Rosa still has the notebook. The page with the question is worn at the corner from being opened and opened again. She does not look at it for inspiration. She looks at it to remember that she was the one who asked, that she was the one who noticed the voice was not hers. That is the proof she needed, not of wealth, but of authorship. She started writing her own story on a Tuesday in March, and every financial decision since has been made, however imperfectly, by her. Not by a label, by her. That is what this chapter was always moving toward. You are not behind. You were mislabeled. And the last chapter of this book is going to ask you to do the one thing that makes it permanent. Chapter 10. Abundance recognizes its own, that is you. You have made it to the last page, and something in you already knows this is not an ending. That is worth noticing. Most people who feel behind financially do not finish things. They sample, they skim, they circle the edge of change, and then return to the familiar weight of not quite trying. You finished. The question worth sitting with right now, before this chapter gives you anything, is why you kept going. Not as a compliment, as a clue. The person who finishes is not the same person who started. If you look closely at that gap, the distance between who opened chapter 1 and who is reading these words right now, you will find something that was always there, waiting to be recognized. You were not built for scarcity. You were labeled for it. There is a permanent difference between those two things. This chapter intends to make that difference impossible for you to forget. Here is the open loop you are going to carry for the next few minutes. There is a moment, one specific moment, when a label stops being something done to you and starts being something you do to yourself. We will get there. But first, you need to understand what you are actually walking away from. The labeling system is not a villain with a face. It never was. It is a collection of voices that spoke before you had the words to answer back. A parent who said money does not grow on trees so many times it became your inner weather forecast. A neighborhood that treated financial struggle as the natural climate of people like you, a fact of geography rather than a condition that could be changed. A school, a culture, a set of circumstances that handed you an identity the way a hospital tags a newborn, efficiently, automatically, without asking. You were stamped before you could object. Then you grew up inside that stamp. It became the shape of the room you thought you had to live in forever. Look back at the person you were at that point 3 years back and look at it plainly. Not the place you hoped to be, the place you were really standing. Think about the way you spoke about money then, the words you used, the ceiling you accepted, the version of yourself you had already agreed to be. Most people, when they do this honestly, feel a small ache, not regret exactly, more like recognition of how long they answered to the wrong name. That ache is important. Do not rush past it. There is a parable worth telling here. Her name was Renata. She ran a small alterations shop on the second floor of a building most people walked past without looking up. She was skilled, genuinely, precisely skilled, but she charged less than every other tailor in the area. She had learned early that her neighborhood did not pay more than a certain amount for anything. She had internalized the ceiling of the block and applied it to herself. One afternoon, a woman came in carrying a coat made in Milan. She asked for specific work that required real expertise. Renata quoted her usual price. The woman paused, looked around the small room, looked at the coat in her hands, and said quietly, "I think this work is worth more than that." Renata stopped. She had been so practiced at pricing herself to the room she was in that she had never once priced herself to the work she was actually capable of doing. She revised the number. The woman did not flinch. That coat led to 2 referrals. Those referrals led to a waiting list. Nothing changed in Renata's hands. Everything changed in the name she answered to. The work was never the problem. The label was. Now here is the moment the open loop closes. The moment a label stops being something done to you and becomes something you do to yourself. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It happens quietly the first time someone offers you a larger version of yourself and you correct them. The first time you are seen accurately and you apologize for it. The first time abundance shows up with your name on it and you hand it back because the name feels borrowed. That is the moment, not when the label was applied, when you started applying it yourself. You have been doing that, not because you are weak, because repetition is persuasive. You have heard the smaller version of yourself described so many times, by so many voices, in so many rooms, that it started to sound like biography rather than fiction. But biography can be revised when you discover the original author was wrong about who you were. Here is the revelation this whole book has been building toward. Wealth does not need to find you. It was always yours. The original abundance, the one that existed before the labels, before the voices, before the stamped identity you were handed without consent, that was your starting point, not your destination. You were not born behind. You were born whole. The mislabeling came after, and what comes after can be corrected. Correcting it is not a single loud act. It is a quiet, repeated choice to answer to your real name instead of the borrowed one. It means when someone offers you a number that matches the quality of your work, you do not correct them downward. It means when an opportunity arrives that feels slightly too large for the version of yourself you have been rehearsing, you do not send it away with an apology. It means the next time scarcity presents itself as fact, you look at it the way you look at a sticker on a piece of fruit, something applied in transit, not grown in. The sticker was always removable. You just needed someone to tell you it was not your skin. This is the one thing that makes the change permanent. Not the knowledge. You have knowledge. Not the insight. You have had insight before and watched it fade when ordinary life resumed its usual shape around you. The one thing that makes this permanent is identity, not the identity that was handed to you. The one you claim out loud in the small daily decisions no one else will see, in the way you price yourself, present yourself, position yourself relative to what you actually deserve. You are not a person who is trying to become abundant. You are an abundant person who was mislabeled. You have spent this book peeling back the layers of that label until you reach something true. This is what you found underneath, not a new version of you, the original one. Abundance recognizes its own. That is not a poetic phrase. It is a practical description of how the world actually works. The people who receive more are not luckier. They are not smarter. They are not born into some separate category of human. They are people who, at some point, stopped correcting the world when it tried to give them what they were worth. They stood still and let the right label land. They answered to the bigger name. You have that name. You have always had it. Walk out of this book and answer to it. You were never poor. You were just mislabeled.